Hey everybody, this is MGC, Music Commentary Gaming, or MGC Act rather, Music Gaming Commentary. Today we're looking at a topic that is not really paid attention to, especially in American history. It's a day that, it's a war that actually goes down in infamy in American history. It's called the War of 1812. This is an event where we have the capital, Washington, D.C., actually being attacked. So we can see this here is a depiction of the White House being burned, and or is it the Capitol building? In either case, here's the aftermath based on an artist's depiction. The original Capitol after the fire of 1814 from a drawing at Chittenden. Okay, so I'm going to read this article. I believe it's from the Canadian Encyclopedia, so not very biased at all. These are the victors, so they write the history. Article by James H. Marsh and Pierre Berton, updated by Tabitha Marshall. It was originally published on March the 6th, 2012, so 200 years later, and was last edited October 31st, 2018, about 3 years ago. The War of 1812, which lasted from 1812 to 1814, was a military conflict between the United States and Great Britain. As a colony of Great Britain, Canada was swept up in the War of 1812 and was invaded several times by the Americans. The war was fought in Upper Canada, Lower Canada, on the Great Lakes and the Atlantic, and in the United States. The Peace Treaty of Ghent in 1814, which ended the war, largely returned the status quo. However, in Canada, the war contributed to a growing sense of national identity, including the idea that civilian soldiers were largely responsible for repelling the American invaders. In contrast, the First Nations allies of the British and Canadian cause suffered much because of the war. Not only had they lost many warriors, including the great Tecumseh, they also lost any hope of halting American expansion in the West, and their contributions were quickly forgotten by their British and Canadian allies. See First Nations and Métis peoples in the War of 1812. Note, this article focuses primarily on land campaigns. For more detailed discussion of naval campaigns, see the Atlantic Campaign of the War of 1812 and War on the Lakes in the War of 1812. Here's a picture called The Battle of New Orleans by Morin. This painting by Edward Percy Morin, or Morin, depicts the last major confrontation of the War of 1812, the Battle of New Orleans. The battle is best remembered for General Andrew Jackson's stiff resistance to British incursion and for the death of British Major General Edward Pakenham. Causes of the War of 1812. The origins of the War of 1812 were in the conflict that raged in Europe for almost 2 decades after Napoleon Bonaparte became first consul, later Emperor of France. These Napoleonic Wars from 1799 to 1815 caused Great Britain to adopt measures that greatly aggravated the United States. On November 21st, 1806, Napoleon ordered a blockade of shipping, the Berlin Decree, aimed at crippling British trade. He ordered all European ports under his control closed to British ships and further decreed that neutral and French ships would be seized if they visited a British port before entering a continental port, the so called continental system. Great Britain responded to Napoleon with a series of orders in council requiring all neutral ships to obtain a license before they could sail to Europe. Following the victory of Lord Nelson at Trafalgar in 21st October 1805, Great Britain had the sea power to enforce its blockade of France. For many years, the Americans had grappled with the problems of being a neutral nation in the Great European War. Tensions mounted as the British began stopping American ships from trading in Europe. Even more vexing was the British practice of searching American vessels for contraband, defined by the British as goods they declared illegal, and of searching for deserters who had fled the harsh conditions of the Royal Navy. Many of these deserters had taken jobs on American ships, but American certificates of citizenship made no impression on the British. Moreover, some British captains even tried to impress or seize native born Americans and put them into service on British ships. There's a picture of HMS Leopard, USS Chesapeake. The battle between the British warship HMS Leopard on the left and the American warship the US Chesapeake on the right on June the 22nd, 1807, in which the British attacked and boarded the Chesapeake, was a catalyst for all out war a few years later. These maritime tensions exploded literally in 1807 off the shore of the Chesapeake Bay. While a British naval squadron was watching the area for French ships, several British sailors deserted and promptly enlisted in the American Navy. The captain of the American 38 gun frigate Chesapeake knew that he had deserters on board when HMS Leopard tried to board and search his ship. When the Chesapeake refused to heave to, the 50 gun Leopard opened fire, killing 3 and injuring 18 of the crew. The British boarded and seized 4 men, known as the Chesapeake Affair. The event outraged even temperate Americans. Several years later, on May the 1st, 1811, officers from the British ship HMS Guerriere impressed an American sailor from a coastal vessel, causing further tension. And again, impress means to seize. This dispute over maritime rights might have been resolved with diplomacy. In fact, the new British government of Lord Liverpool rescinded the orders in council a few days before the US declared war, though the news hadn't reached America in time. Moreover, not all Americans wanted war with Great Britain, notably the merchants of New England and New York. And it's notable that if they had email back then, maybe this war could have been prevented. But no, it took a lot more time for messages to be relayed. However, President James Madison was intrigued by the analysis of Major General Henry Dearborn that in the event of war, Canada would be easy pickings, even that an invasion would be welcomed by the Canadians. Furthermore, the War Hawks, a group of congressmen from the South and West, loudly demanded war. Motivated by Anglophobia and nationalism, these Republicans encouraged war as a means to retaliate against Britain for the economic distress caused by the blockade and for what they perceived as British support for the First Nations in resisting American expansion into the West. On June 18th, 1812, President Madison signed a declaration of war against Great Britain, supported by both the Senate and Congress. American and British planning. As American leaders planned their invasion of Canada, they quickly decided that Upper Canada was the most vulnerable to attack. The Atlantic provinces were protected by British sea power, and Lower Canada was protected by its remoteness and by the fortress of Quebec, see Quebec City in the War of 1812. In contrast, Upper Canada seemed to be an easy target. The population was predominantly American, and the province was lightly defended. Upper Canada was defended by about 1,600 British regulars, formed mostly from the 41st Regiment of Foot and detachments from other units. However, the badly outnumbered British were in fact better prepared than the Americans knew. The 41st Regiment of British Regulars had been reinforced by a number of militia units, although their loyalty and reliability was uncertain. The Provincial Marine controlled Lake Ontario. Much of the preparation was thanks to the foresight of Major General Sir Isaac Brock, Administrator of Upper Canada. Brock had a thorough grasp of the challenges of the upcoming conflict and had been preparing for 5 years, reinforcing fortifications, training militia units, and perhaps most important, developing alliances with the First Nations. First Nations and Métis peoples in the War of 1812. Six Nations Warriors War of 1812. This is a studio portrait taken in July 1882 of the surviving Six Nations warriors who fought with the British in the War of 1812. From right to left, Sakawaraton, John Smoke Johnson, born circa 1792, and John Tutela, born circa 1797, and Young Warner, born circa 1794. First Nations and Métis peoples played a significant role in Canada in the War of 1812. The conflict forced various Indigenous peoples to overcome long standing differences and unite against a common enemy. It sounds like a movie. It also strained alliances such as the Iroquois Haudenosaunee Confederacy, in which some nations were allied with American forces. Most First Nations strategically allied themselves with Great Britain during the war, seeing the British as the lesser of two colonial evils. See Indigenous British Relations pre Confederation. And the group most interested in maintaining a traditional territories and trade. Here's a depiction of Tecumseh, Shawnee chief. Tecumseh allied his forces with those of the British during the War of 1812, and his active participation was crucial. Two Shawnee brothers, Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa, 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 implored indigenous peoples to unite in order to defend their dwindling lands against the growing incursions of American settlers and the United States government. The promise of such an aboriginal state never came to fruition. During negotiations for the Treaty of Ghent in 1814 that ended the war, the British tried to bargain for the creation of an Indian territory, but the American delegates refused to agree. The meeting of Brock and Tecumseh. For indigenous peoples living in British North America, the War of 1812 marked the end of an era of self reliance and self determination. Soon they would become outnumbered by settlers in their own lands. Any social or political influence enjoyed before the war dissipated. Within a generation, the contributions of so many different peoples working together with their British and Canadian allies against a common foe would be all but forgotten. The British attack is a picture of Isaac Brock, military hero. He was long remembered as the fallen hero and savior of Upper Canada. Sir Isaac Brock was dissatisfied by the number of troops at his disposal, with only some 1,600 regulars in the province. But he was not prepared to simply wait passively for the Americans to act. He believed that a bold military stroke would galvanize the population and encourage First Nations to come to his side. He therefore sent orders to the commanding officer of Fort St. Joseph on Lake Huron to capture a key American post at Michilimackinac Island on 17th July. Nearly 400 Dakota Sioux, Menominee, Winnebago, Odawa, and Ojibwe warriors, along with 45 British soldiers and some 200 voyageurs, including Métis, captured the fort quickly and without bloodshed. Here's a painting Amherst Navy Yard, Britain's Upper Lakes naval base just before the Battle of Lake Erie. In the midst of supply shortages, the crew of the new flagship HMS Detroit is seen fitting a sail borrowed from the HMS Queen Charlotte, anchored on the right. After their defeat on the lake, the British abandoned this site and located their new Upper Lakes naval base at Penetanguishene on Lake Huron. Meanwhile, an American force under General William Hull had crossed from Detroit into Canada, forcing Brock to quickly march his men from the town of York to counter the invasion. When he arrived at the British fort at Amherstburg, Brock found that the American invasion force had already withdrawn to Detroit. With the great Shawnee chief Tecumseh at his side, he boldly demanded that Hull surrender Detroit, which the hapless general did on August 16th, in effect giving the British control of Michigan Territory and the upper Mississippi. Here's a painting, Bombardment of Fort Detroit. The surprise capitulation of Fort Detroit in August 1812 was preceded by a naval bombardment from the Detroit River. The brig HMS General Hunter and HMS Queen Charlotte sent volleys into the fort and walled town of Detroit. Damage was minimal, but the cannon fire had a powerful psychological effect nevertheless. Did you know Shawnee War Chief Tecumseh, 1768 to 1813, only lived to, what's that, 32, 45, sided with the British not because he fully trusted them, but because he saw them as a strategic ally with common interests. Tecumseh combined a passionate concern for his people with an acute strategic military sense. During the War of 1812, a large number of indigenous nations fought under Tecumseh, who gained the alliance of the Potawatomi, Ojibwa, Shawnee, Odawa, Kickapoo, and others, though not all groups supported him. Sounds like Avatar. Campaigns in Upper Canada. At this point, Thomas Jefferson's remark that the capture of Canada was a mere matter of marching returned to haunt Washington. Having lost one army at Detroit, the Americans lost another at Queenston Heights. After their militia refused to cross into Canada, citing the constitutional guarantee that it would not have to fight on foreign soil. However, during the engagement, Brock was killed, a significant loss to the British and Canadian cause. Did you know? Outnumbered more than 10 to 1, Mohawk chiefs John Norton, Tayanin Hokarawan, and John Brant, Ayan Wags, and about 80 other Haudenosaunee and Delaware warriors held back American forces at Queenston Heights for several hours. They're outnumbered 10 to 1, long enough for reinforcements to arrive so that the British could retain the crucial outpost. Death of Isaac Brock, the Battle of Queenston Heights. The Battle of Queenston Heights on October 13th, 1812, was both a victory and a tragedy for the British and Canadian forces against the invading American army and resulted in the death of Isaac Brock. A new American army under William Henry Harrison struggled up from Kentucky to try to retake Detroit. One wing was so badly mauled at Frenchtown by a force of British, Canadians, and First Nations under Lieutenant Colonel Henry Proctor that further attempts at invasion that winter were abandoned. The only Americans in Canada were prisoners of war. With the death of Brock, British strategy was to act defensively and allow the invaders to make mistakes. Governor Sir George Prevost, conserved his thinned forces carefully, keeping a strong garrison at Quebec and sending reinforcements to Upper Canada only when additional troops arrived from overseas. Here's a portrait of Sir George Prevost. Colored Corps. The Colored Corps was a militia company of black men raised during the War of 1812 by Richard Pierpont, a formerly enslaved man from Bandu or Senegal and military veteran of the American Revolution. Created in Upper Canada, where enslavement had been limited in 1793, the Corps was composed of free and enslaved black men. Many were veterans of the American Revolution, in which they fought for the British. The Colored Corps fought in the Battle of Queenston Heights and the Battle of Fort George before it was attached to the Royal Engineers as a construction company. The company was disbanded on March 24th, 1815, following the end of the war. In claiming rewards for their service, many faced adversity and discrimination. Sergeant William Thompson was informed he must go and look for his pay himself, while Richard Pierpont, then in his 70s, was denied his request for passage home to Africa in lieu of a land grant. When grants were distributed in 1821, veterans of the Colored Corps received only 100 acres, half that of their white counterparts. Many veterans did not settle the land they were granted because it was of poor quality. Despite these inequities, the Colored Corps defended Canada honorably, setting the precedent for the formation of black units in future. Here's a portrait of a black soldier, a member of the 104th Regiment of Foot. Campaigns under Campaigns in Upper Canada. As the campaign of 1813 opened, an American flotilla of 16 ships landed at York, now Toronto, the capital of Upper Canada. The Americans briefly occupied the town, burning the public buildings and seizing valuable naval supplies destined for Lake Erie. However, the British frustrated the American plan to appropriate a half completed warship at York by burning it instead. Had the Americans succeeded, they might have gained greater control over Lake Ontario. As it was, neither side totally controlled that lake for the balance of the war. The Americans soon abandoned York, and on May 27, 1813, their fleet seized Fort George at the mouth of the Niagara River. While this was the bleakest period of the war for the British, the military situation was not irretrievable. The Americans did not take advantage of their success and failed to immediately pursue General John Vincent and his army as they retreated from Fort George to Burlington Heights. The American forces did not set out from Fort George until June the 2nd, allowing the British time to recover and prepare. On the night of June 5th, 1813, Vincent's men attacked the American forces at Stony Creek. In a fierce battle, the British dislodged the Americans, capturing two of their generals. The dispirited American force retired towards Niagara. Here's a painting, the Battle of Stony Creek. British redcoats in the field at the Battle of Stony Creek. The engagement at Stony Creek returned the Niagara Peninsula to British and Canadian control and ended the U.S. attempt to conquer the western part of the province. I just want to mention before I continue on that thousands, hundreds and thousands of men gave their lives so that this land could be free, both lands, America and Canada. I think we need to appreciate that. I think that's why we have Veterans Day, Remembrance Day. Um, yeah, their sacrifice of giving their lives and their health and going, laying their lives on the line for us, for future generations to live on this land of North America is greatly appreciated by myself. The Americans suffered another defeat 3 weeks later at Beaver Dams, where some 600 men were captured by a force of 300 Kanawake and a further 100 Mohawk warriors led by Captain William Kerr. The British had been warned of the American attack by Laura Secord, a loyalist whose husband had been wounded at the Battle of Queenston Heights. And that is one of the great interventions there in the war. Did you know Laura Secord walked 30 kilometers from Queenston to Beaver Dams near Thorold to warn James Fitzgibbon that the Americans were planning to attack his outpost? Secord took a cir- circuitous took a circuitous route through inhospitable terrain to avoid American sentries on her trek, and was helped by a group of Mohawk warriors she encountered along the way. Interesting story. That could be a movie, like an actual feature film, not a little clip. But finally, worn down by sickness, desertion, and the departure of short term soldiers, the American command evacuated Fort George on December the 10th and quit Canada. On leaving, the militia burned the town of Newark, or Niagara on the Lake, an act that drove the British to brutal retaliation at Buffalo. These incendiary reprisals continued until Washington itself was burned by the British the following August. War on the western flank. The Americans fared better on the western flank. The British tried and failed to take William Henry Harrison's stronghold at Fort Meigs on the Maumee River. A struggle for control of Lake Erie followed. The two rival fleets, both built of green lumber on the shores of the lake, met on September the 10th, 1813 at Put en Bay. The British were hampered by the American seizure of naval supplies at York the previous spring and by the loss early in the battle of several senior officers. American Commodore Oliver Hazard Perry, a bold seaman, used unorthodox tactics to turn defeat into victory and become the first man in history to capture an entire British fleet. Quite an accomplishment. U.S. Admiral Perry, the Battle of Put in Bay, Lake Erie. U.S. Admiral Oliver Perry at Put in Bay during the Battle of Lake Erie, the moment when he rowed his way through enemy fire from the severely damaged St. Lawrence to the Niagara. I'm going to take a look at this picture, see how big this picture is. Okay, it's not letting me open it. I'll open image in new tab. Okay. There it is. Okay. Continuing on. That's quite a that's quite an accomplishment. The Americans gained dominance over the upper Great Lakes, and Lake Erie, in effect, became an American lake. The British Army abandoned Detroit and retreated up the Thames River. Henry Proctor delayed fatally in his retreat. However, and Harrison caught up with him at the Battle of the Thames, Moravian town. There, the exhausted British regulars and First Nations warriors were routed and scattered. Proctor fled, and Tecumseh was killed. The defeat was not fatal to the province, as Harrison could not follow up his victory. His Kentuckians were eager to get back to their farms at harvest time, but it effectively ended the First Nations alliance. Here's another picture, a painting of the Battle of the Thames. Depicts the October 5th battle that resulted in the death of legendary Shawnee war chief Tecumseh. On Lake Huron, the American fleet searched for British supply vessels, which led to the sinking of the Nancy. They also raised Sault Ste. Marie on July 21st, 1814, and attempted to recapture Fort Michilimackinac. The British regained a presence on the lake in early September with the capture of the Tigress and Scorpion. The war in Lower Canada. American forces also invaded Lower Canada during the war. The Americans could potentially have struck a mortal blow against the British in Lower Canada, but their invading armies, which outnumbered the British 10 to 1, were led with almost incredible ineptitude by Generals James Wilkinson and Wade Hampton. A miscellaneous force of British regulars, voltigeurs, militia, and First Nations harassed the advancing Americans and turned the invasion back at Chateauguay, October 25th to 26th, 1813, under Lieutenant Colonel Charles de Salaberry, and at Chrysler's Farm near Cornwall, Ontario. On November 11th, 1813, under Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Wanton Morrison. Voltigeurs. The Canadian Voltigeurs was a volunteer corps raised and commanded by Charles Michel de Rumberry de Salaberry, lots of berries, a British Army officer born in Beauport, Lower Canada. The Voltigeurs were initially assigned to defend the eastern townships. And here's a picture performing target practice. They have a similar outfit to the British Guard, the furry hat there. In November 1812, they faced American Major General Dearborn and his 6,000 strong force, who invaded the region from Plattsburgh. De Salaberry rushed with a company of voltigeurs and 230 Kanawake Mohawk warriors to staunch the invasion at La Colle. While they could not halt the invasion, days of skirmishing increased the cost, and Dearborn retreated days later. In the spring of 1813, the Voltigeur unit split, with some bolstered the defenses at Kingston and others participating in the failed assault on Sackett's Harbor. Last invasion of Upper Canada. The following year, 1814, the Americans again invaded Upper Canada, crossing the Niagara River at Buffalo. They easily seized Fort Erie on July 3rd, and on July 5th turned back a rash attack by the British under General Phineas Riall at Chippewa. The whole Niagara campaign came to a climax with the bloodiest battle of the war at Lundy's Lane on July 25th. Fought in the pitch dark of a sultry night by exhausted troops who could not tell friend from foe, it ended in a stalemate. The Battle of Lundy's Lane. Lundy's Lane was the site of a battle fought between American troops and British regulars, assisted by Canadian fencibles and militia on the sultry evening of July 25th. It was one of the most important battles of the war, halting the American advance into Upper Canada. It's funny how all this just makes sense after you're done school. I remember learning this in school and just went in the one year, went out the other. I mean, you remember some key characters and places, but you don't really understand it. You don't really internalize it and see the bigger picture of what's going on. The American invasion was now effectively spent, and they withdrew to Fort Erie. Here, they badly trounced the forces of the new British commander, Lieutenant General Gordon Drummond, when he attempted a night attack. With both sides exhausted, a 3-month standoff followed. Finally, on November the 5th, the Americans again withdrew across the Niagara River, effectively ending the war in Upper Canada, invading the United States. On the Atlantic front, Nova Scotia's Lieutenant Governor Sir John Sherbrooke led a force from Halifax into Maine, capturing Castine on September the 1st. By the middle of September, British forces held much of the Maine coast, which was returned to the U.S. only with the signing of the peace treaty in December 1814. The most formidable effort by the British in 1814 was the invasion of northern New York, in which Governor Sir George Prevost led 11,000 British veterans of the Napoleonic Wars to Plattsburgh on Lake Champlain. However, Prevost was hesitant to attack, and the defeat of the British fleet in Plattsburgh Bay by the American Commodore Thomas Macdonough on September 11th led Prevost to withdraw his troops. The Treaty of Ghent. Prevost's decision to withdraw from American territory affected peace negotiations in Ghent, which had begun in August 1814. Had Prevost's invasion succeeded, much of Upper New York State might be Canadian today. However, his withdrawal forced the British peace negotiators at Ghent to lower their demands and accept the status quo. When the treaty was signed on Christmas Eve 1814, all conquests were to be restored, and disputes over boundaries were deferred to joint commissions. Hostilities continued after the peace treaty was signed. However, the last battle of the war is often cited as the Battle of New Orleans, January 8th, 1815. But British and American forces also clashed on February 11th, 1815, at Fort Bowyer on Mobile Bay. Several naval engagements also followed the signing of the treaty, including the final battle of the war between the U.S. sloop Peacock and East India cruiser Nautilus in the Indian Ocean, 4.5 months after the peace treaty was signed. Who won or lost the War of 1812? Washington had expected the largely American population of Upper Canada to throw off the British yoke as soon as its army crossed the border. This did not happen. Lured northwards by free land and low taxes, most settlers wanted to be left alone. Thus, the British and Loyalist elite were able to set Canadians on a different course from that of their former enemy. And free land and low taxes, exactly the opposite now in Canada. It's more like the highest taxes compared to America. Several units of the Canadian militia actively participated in the war. This included the Colored Corps, a small corps of Black Canadians that fought at the Battle of Queenston Heights. Although the majority of the fighting was done by British regulars and First Nations warriors, a myth developed that civilian soldiers had won the war, and this helped to germinate the seeds of nationalism in the Canadas. Canada owes its present shape to negotiations that grew out of the peace, while the war itself, or the myths created by the war, gave Canadians their first sense of community and laid the foundation for their future nationhood. To this extent, the Canadians were the real winners of the War of 1812. For the Americans, the outcome was more ambiguous. Since the issues of impressment and maritime rights were not resolved in the peace treaty, the war could be considered a failure. However, the Americans had some spectacular victories at sea, which were indicators of the future potential of American power. The war was certainly a failure for the warhawks who wanted to annex or take over Canada. The war proved that this was not militarily feasible. The conclusions that the war was a second war of independence or a war of honor and respect are less easy to judge. If the winners are qualified, the losers are easier to identify. The death of Tecumseh and the defeat of the First Nations at the Battle of the Thames broke apart Tecumseh's Confederacy. Similarly, in the related defeat of the Creek Nation, any hope of halting American expansion into First Nations territory effectively ended. While in Canada, the First Nations fared better in preserving their land and culture. In the end, the British abandoned their Indigenous allies in the peace, just as they had several times before. So, we can see Indigenous peoples looks like they lost. They took big losses from this War of 1812. But bigger picture, Canada is a free land. Um, America is a free land too. And despite the atrocities that were committed and the bloodshed and all the conflicts and many battles that were fought as a result of this war, the two nations, our two nations of America and Canada, maintain friendly relations. Um, Perhaps it's due to the following world wars, World War One and World War Two, where we had a common enemy. Perhaps that's what it was. But it's interesting to read this and to remember the lives lost and the strategies employed and the bravery that was displayed. These young men put their nation first and not themselves. Tecumseh didn't put himself first. He put the interests of the indigenous peoples first, uniting many different tribes and peoples for a common goal against a common enemy. But it is sad to learn that not only did he lose his life, but the indigenous peoples were a lot worse off as a result of the war. As much as the media like to push different agendas, the truth of the matter is war is hell, and there's so many destructive consequences. On the bright side, the countries are free, and we as a people, at least those who are living in America and Canada, are relatively free and enjoy so much prosperity. So it's with this note I give my full respect and appreciation and commemorate all the lives lost and the bravery shown uh, during this war to both sides because we should not forget what had been done. I'm not justifying that war is good, but it's history, and we need to learn from it and to understand how these nations came about, how these nations were able to get through it, to get through that time, and despite all the lives lost and the conflicts, they still uh, were able to come up with a peace solution, and war did not continue. Not like in other countries in other areas of the world where yes, a war ends, but there's the tensions remain. Look at India and Pakistan. Look at a lot of areas in the world where, yeah, wars ended, decades and centuries ago, but there's still this bad blood, this unwritten hate. It's just there. It's just ever present. However, we can see between America and Canada, the relations are very friendly. And we could even joke with each other, American citizens to Canadian citizens and joke about it. I mean, it wouldn't be in good taste to joke about it, but I mean, we can tease each other and let bygones be bygones. This is a war that happened, and there's no hard feelings in terms of that we're just itching to have another war between these two nations. No, um, I'm not saying they did war right, but they did peace a lot better than a lot of countries are able to manage and to move forward. So that's all I have for this video on the War of 1812. I wanted to read this and just close the tab, but I thought, let me share it with other people if they wanted to learn about this because I find it very fascinating, especially when you're just reading it for your own pleasure, not being forced to learn it in school. So, thank you very much for your time. This is again MGC, music, gaming, and commentary. Till next time.